In the early summer of 1967, the Middle East was filled with tension that could almost be felt in the air. Soldiers stood along dusty borders, tanks waited in the desert, and radios carried speeches from leaders who spoke of pride, danger, and the possibility of war. For weeks the region watched and waited, unsure of what would happen next. Then, on a quiet morning in June, the waiting ended. Within hours, aircraft were in the sky. Armies were moving across deserts and hills, and a conflict had begun that would reshape the Middle East in just 6 extraordinary days. In June 1967, a conflict erupted in the Middle East that would dramatically change the political landscape of the region in less than a single week. The war lasted only 6 days, yet its consequences would influence international politics, regional relations, and the lives of millions of people for decades to come. Known as the Six-Day War, the conflict was fought primarily between Israel and a coalition of neighboring Arab states, including Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. To understand why the war happened so suddenly and why it developed with such speed, it is necessary to look at the years of tension that have been building across the Middle East since the end of the Second World War. The roots of the conflict stretched back to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, an event that transformed the political map of the region and triggered a series of wars and disputes between Israel and several Arab countries. When Israel declared its independence in 1948, neighboring Arab nations quickly entered into conflict with a new state. That first war ended with armistice agreements, but not with a lasting peace. Borders were drawn, but many of the deeper political disagreements remained unresolved. For the following 2 decades, relations between Israel and its neighbors were marked by mistrust, periodic violence, and continuing disputes over territory and national identity. During these years, the region experienced frequent border incidents and military skirmishes. Armed groups crossed frontiers, patrols exchanged fire, and each side accused the other of provoking conflict. These events did not always escalate into full-scale war, but they created a climate of constant tension. Egypt, under the leadership of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, played an important role in shaping the political atmosphere of the region during this period. Nasser had become one of the most influential figures in the Arab world. He promoted ideas of Arab unity and independence from foreign influence, and many people across the Middle East saw him as a symbol of resistance and national pride. At the same time, Israel remained concerned about its security in a region where several neighboring countries did not recognize its legitimacy as a state. Israeli leaders believed that maintaining a strong military was essential for survival in such a tense environment. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, the border between Israel and its neighbors remained unstable. Clashes occurred along the frontiers with Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. In particular, the border with Syria saw frequent artillery exchanges and confrontations related to disputes over water resources and territory. Another important factor was the presence of Palestinian refugees who had been displaced during the earlier Arab-Israeli conflict. Many of these refugees lived in camps in neighboring countries. The political question of their future and their right to return remained unresolved and contributed to the ongoing tensions. By the mid-1960s, the atmosphere across the region had become increasingly strained. Military forces on all sides were growing stronger, and political rhetoric between leaders was becoming more confrontational. Each government feared that its security might be threatened by the actions of its rivals. The immediate events that led to the Six-Day War began in the spring of 1967. Reports and rumors circulated about possible military movements along various borders. Alliances between Arab states were strengthened, and troops began moving into positions that suggested the possibility of a larger confrontation. One of the most significant developments occurred when Egypt moved military forces into the Sinai Peninsula, the desert region that separates Egypt from Israel. At the same time, Egypt requested that United Nations peacekeeping forces withdraw from the area. These peacekeepers have been stationed there for several years to help prevent renewed fighting after earlier conflicts. Soon afterward, Egypt announced that it would close the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. This narrow waterway provided Israel with access to the Red Sea and was considered extremely important for trade and security. Israeli leaders viewed the closure of the strait as a serious threat. Meanwhile, other Arab countries, including Jordan and Syria, strengthened their military cooperation with Egypt. Agreements were signed, and troops were mobilized across several borders. Across the region, armies prepared for the possibility that war might soon begin. As tension rose day by day, diplomats attempted to prevent the situation from escalating further. However, the atmosphere of suspicion and fear made compromise extremely difficult. By early June 1967, the Middle East stood on the edge of a major conflict. Armies were in position, alliances had formed, and both sides believed that the coming days might determine the future balance of power in the region. Within this tense atmosphere, a sudden series of events would soon trigger one of the most dramatic and rapid wars in modern history. By the beginning of June 1967, the Middle East had reached a moment of extreme tension. Armies were mobilized, alliances had been strengthened, and the atmosphere across the region was filled with uncertainty and fear. Political leaders on all sides were aware that a single decision could ignite a major conflict. Israel found itself surrounded by several neighboring countries whose military forces had been placed on high alert. Egyptian troops were positioned in the Sinai Peninsula, Syrian forces stood along the northern border, and Jordan had entered into a defense agreement with Egypt. For Israeli leaders, the situation appeared increasingly dangerous. They feared that if several armies attacked at the same time, the country could face a severe threat to its security. Inside Israel, government officials and military commanders debated their options carefully. Some believed that waiting for an attack could place the country at a serious disadvantage. Others hoped that international diplomacy might still prevent a war. As the days passed and the military buildup continued, the pressure to act grew stronger. Finally, during the early morning hours of June 5, 1967, Israel launched a carefully planned military operation that would change the course of the conflict almost immediately. The operation focused on the use of air power, and its goal was to disable the air forces of neighboring countries before they could be used in battle. Shortly after sunrise, large numbers of Israeli aircraft took off from air bases and flew toward Egyptian territory. The pilots flew at extremely low altitudes across the desert in order to avoid detection by radar systems. Their objective was to strike Egyptian airfields where many military aircraft were parked on ground. When the Israeli planes reached their targets, they launched a series of coordinated attacks on runways, aircraft, and military installations. The strikes were carried out quickly and with great precision. Many Egyptian aircraft were destroyed before they were able to take off. Within a short period of time, a significant portion of Egypt's air force had been severely damaged. This gave Israel a major advantage in the skies above the battlefield. Without strong air support, Egyptian ground forces in the Sinai Peninsula would face serious difficulties defending their positions. As the attacks continued, Israeli aircraft also struck airfields in other neighboring countries, including Syria and Jordan. These operations were intended to reduce the ability of those nations to use their air forces against Israeli territory. The rapid success of the air campaign had an immediate impact on the war. Control of the air allowed Israeli forces to operate with greater freedom across several fronts. At the same time, the destruction of many aircraft limited the ability of opposing forces to respond effectively. While these dramatic events were unfolding in the sky, fighting had also begun on the ground. In the Sinai Peninsula, Israeli ground forces advanced toward Egyptian positions. The Sinai was a vast desert region with wide, open spaces and long distances between defensive positions. Armored units moved across the desert, supported by artillery and aircraft. The battles in this region involved tanks, infantry units, and coordinated maneuvers across the desert landscape. Egyptian forces attempted to hold their defensive lines, but the rapid developments of the air war and the speed of Israeli ground advances created confusion in several areas. As the fighting intensified, communication between some Egyptian units became difficult. Orders were delayed or misunderstood, and the situation on the battlefield changed rapidly from hour to hour. In some locations, Egyptian troops fought determinedly, while in others they withdrew to regroup or establish new defensive positions. At the same time, another front of the war opened along the border with Jordan. Jordanian artillery began firing on parts of Jerusalem and other Israeli positions. Israeli forces responded by moving troops toward areas controlled by Jordan, including parts of the West Bank. The city of Jerusalem soon became one of the most sensitive locations in the conflict. The city held deep religious and historical significance for several communities, and control of its neighborhoods had long been divided between Israeli and Jordanian authorities. Fighting around Jerusalem involved infantry units moving through urban streets, defensive positions, and nearby hills. The situation in the city developed quickly as both sides attempted to secure strategic locations. Meanwhile, along the northern frontier, tensions with Syria also escalated. The border between Israel and Syria had been the site of earlier clashes even before the war began. Now the conflict threatened to expand into a full military confrontation across that region as well. Within just the first 2 days of the war, it had become clear that the conflict was unfolding with remarkable speed. The early airstrikes had changed the balance of power, and ground battles were spreading across multiple fronts at once. For many observers around the world, the rapid pace of events was surprising. Wars between nations often lasted months or years, yet this conflict seemed to be moving forward hour by hour with dramatic developments. As the third day of the war approached, Israeli forces continued advancing across the Sinai Peninsula while fighting intensified in Jerusalem and along other front lines. Each new day brought significant changes to the map of the region. The war that had begun so suddenly was now entering its most decisive phase. By the third day of the war in June 1967, the pace of events across the Middle East had become extraordinarily rapid. In only a short period of time, military operations had spread across several different fronts, and the balance of power on the battlefield was shifting quickly. Israeli forces were advancing in multiple directions, while Egypt, Jordan, and Syria struggled to respond to the fast-moving developments. In the Sinai Peninsula, the fighting between Israeli and Egyptian forces intensified across the wide desert landscape. The Sinai was an enormous region of sand, rocky hills, and long, open stretches of land. For armored units, this terrain allowed large movements of tanks and vehicles, but it also created challenges in communication and coordination. Israeli commanders used fast-moving armor divisions to push deeper into Egyptian defensive lines. Tanks advanced across the desert supported by artillery and aircraft, while infantry units secured important positions along the routes of advance. The speed of these movements created confusion among Egyptian units that were attempting to regroup and establish new defensive positions. In several areas, Egyptian forces fought determinedly and attempted to slow the advance. However, the loss of much of their air support made it difficult to coordinate large defensive operations. Israeli aircraft continued flying missions over the battlefield, observing troop movements and striking supply routes or military positions when opportunities appeared. As the situation developed, many Egyptian units began withdrawing westward toward the Suez Canal, which forms the western boundary of the Sinai Peninsula. The retreat across the desert became difficult and sometimes chaotic, as roads became crowded with vehicles, soldiers, and equipment moving toward the canal. While the desert battles continued in Sinai, another major theater of the war was unfolding in and around Jerusalem. The city had long been divided between Israeli and Jordanian control. Western Jerusalem had been administered by Israel since the earlier Arab-Israeli conflict, while East Jerusalem and the Old City were controlled by Jordan. When the war began, Jordanian artillery fired shells toward Israeli neighborhoods and military positions. Israeli forces responded by launching operations to capture key areas around the city. Fighting in Jerusalem was very different from the open desert battles in Sinai. Instead of tanks crossing wide landscapes, soldiers moved through narrow streets, historic neighborhoods, and fortified positions. The battle for control of Jerusalem was intense and deeply symbolic. Many locations within the city held religious and historical importance for different communities. Israeli forces gradually advanced toward East Jerusalem, encountering Jordanian troops defending key positions along the way. After difficult fighting, Israeli units entered the Old City of Jerusalem. This area contained some of the most historic sites in the region, including places of great significance to several religions. Control of the Old City quickly became one of the most widely discussed moments of the entire war. At the same time that these events were unfolding in Jerusalem, Israeli forces were also advancing through the West Bank, a region located between Israel and the Jordan River. Jordanian forces attempted to defend towns and strategic hills throughout the area, but Israeli units continued moving forward with coordinated ground operations. Over the course of several days, many of the major cities in the West Bank came under Israeli control. The rapid developments changed the political and military situation dramatically. Territory that had previously been administered by Jordan was now under Israeli authority. While the fighting in Sinai and the West Bank captured much of the world's attention, another important front of the war was located along the northern border with Syria. The border between Israel and Syria was marked by the Golan Heights, a rugged plateau rising above the surrounding countryside. For many years before the war, Syrian artillery units had used the high ground of the Golan Heights to fire into Israeli communities located below. Because of this strategic advantage, the region had been a frequent source of tension between the two countries. During the early days of the war, Israeli leaders initially focused most of their military effort on the Egyptian and Jordanian fronts. However, as those battles began to shift in Israel's favor, attention turned increasingly toward the Syrian positions on the Golan Heights. The terrain of the Golan Heights made any attack extremely difficult. Steep slopes, rocky ground, and heavily fortified positions gave Syrian defenders a strong advantage. Military planners understood that advancing uphill against prepared defenses would involve serious risk. Nevertheless, as the war continued into its later days, Israeli forces prepared for an assault on the plateau. Artillery units began firing on Syrian positions, and aircraft conducted strikes against military installations across the region. For soldiers on both sides, the conflict was exhausting and intense. The war had developed with astonishing speed, and each new day brought major changes to the battlefield. Armies moved rapidly, positions shifted, and decisions made by commanders often had immediate and dramatic consequences. By the fifth day of the conflict, the map of the Middle East had already begun to change in significant ways. Israeli forces had advanced deep into the Sinai Peninsula, taking control of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and were preparing to challenge the Syrian defenses on the Golan Heights. The war that had begun so suddenly was now approaching its final and most decisive stage. The coming battles would determine the outcome of the conflict and shape the future of the region for many years to come. By the fifth day of the war in June 1967, the situation across the Middle East had changed dramatically from where it had begun only a few days earlier. The conflict that many had feared might last for months had instead developed at an astonishing speed. Military operations on several fronts had reshaped the battlefield, and the final stage of the war was approaching. In the south, Israeli forces had advanced across most of the Sinai Peninsula. Egyptian units had withdrawn toward the Suez Canal, the narrow waterway that separates the Sinai from mainland Egypt. The canal had long been one of the most important transportation routes in the world, connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. As Egyptian forces retreated westward, Israeli troops reached positions along the eastern side of the canal. The vast desert region that had once served as a defensive barrier was now largely under Israeli control. For Egypt, the loss of the Sinai Peninsula represented a significant strategic setback. While events in Sinai were nearing their conclusion, attention increasingly turned toward the northern front of the war. Along the border with Syria, the rugged plateau, known as the Golan Heights, remained under Syrian control. From these elevated positions, Syrian artillery had long been able to observe and sometimes fire into Israeli communities located in the valleys below. For years, this area had been a source of tension and conflict. Now, with the other fronts of the war largely decided, Israeli leaders began focusing their attention on the Syrian defenses along the heights. The Golan Heights presented one of the most difficult landscapes of the entire conflict. The terrain was steep and rocky, with fortified bunkers and defensive lines prepared by Syrian forces over many years. Any army attempting to advance uphill against such positions faced a serious challenge. Despite these difficulties, Israeli commanders prepared an operation to capture the plateau. Artillery bombardments and airstrikes were used to weaken Syrian defenses before ground forces began their advance. When the attack began, Israeli troops moved up the steep slopes under heavy fire. The fighting was intense, as Syrian soldiers defended their fortified positions with determination. Tanks and infantry units worked together to move slowly forward through the difficult terrain. Gradually, after hours of combat and careful maneuvering, Israeli forces began capturing sections of the heights. Once some of the defensive lines were breached, the balance of the battle began to shift. Israeli units advanced further onto the plateau, gaining control of several key positions. As these developments unfolded, international pressure to end the war was growing rapidly. Governments around the world were closely monitoring the situation, concerned that the conflict might expand further or involve additional countries. Diplomatic efforts intensified through international organizations and foreign governments. Messages were exchanged urging the parties involved to accept a ceasefire before the fighting caused even greater damage and instability. On June 10, 1967, after 6 days of intense military operations, a ceasefire was finally agreed upon. The fighting stopped across the different fronts, bringing an end to one of the shortest yet most dramatic wars in modern history. Although the conflict had lasted less than a week, its consequences were enormous. When the war ended, Israel controlled several territories that had previously been held by neighboring countries. These included the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, which had been administered by Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which had been controlled by Jordan, and the Golan Heights, which had been held by Syria. These territorial changes significantly altered the political map of the region. The war also had a deep psychological and political impact on all of the nations involved. In Israel, the rapid military victory created a sense of relief and security for many citizens who had feared a much longer and more dangerous conflict. At the same time, the newly captured territories raised complex political and diplomatic questions that would continue to influence regional discussions for decades. In the Arab world, the defeat was deeply felt. Leaders and citizens in several countries reflected on the outcome and began reassessing their political and military strategies. The war led to important changes in leadership, policy, and international alliances. The status of the territories captured during the war soon became one of the most complicated issues in Middle Eastern politics. Questions about borders, sovereignty, and the future of the populations living in those areas became central topics in diplomatic negotiations and international discussions. For many historians, the Six-Day War marked a turning point in the modern history of the Middle East. It reshaped relationships between nations, altered military balances, and influenced political debates that continue to the present day. Despite its short duration, the war demonstrated how quickly regional tensions could escalate into a large conflict involving several countries. It also showed how military strategy, geography, and international diplomacy could interact in complex ways during times of crisis. Today, the events of June 1967 remain an important subject of study for historians, political leaders, and scholars seeking to understand the origins of ongoing issues in the Middle East. The Six-Day War lasted only 6 days, yet the changes it produced have continued to shape the region for generations. The decisions made during that brief but intense period remain part of the historical memory of the Middle East and continue to influence discussions about peace, security, and the future of the region.